The doorbell rang at exactly 3:15, just like I'd planned. My granddaughter Emma turned 8 today, and I'd been counting down the hours since dawn. I held the small wrapped box against my chest, a hand-knitted sweater in her favorite purple, with tiny silver buttons I'd saved for months to buy. Through the window, I could see balloons tied to the mailbox, hear the distant laughter of children in the backyard. My heart lifted for the first time in weeks. Today would be different. Today, I'd hold my granddaughter and tell her how proud I was of the smart, kind little girl she was becoming. I pressed the doorbell again, smoothing my dress with nervous fingers. I'd chosen the blue one, the one David used to say made my eyes sparkle. These days my eyes felt more tired than sparkling, but hope had a way of brightening even the weariest face. When the door opened, my son Michael stood there, but not the way a son should greet his mother. His jaw was set, his eyes cold and distant. Behind him, I could glimpse Emma's friends running through the hallway, their voices bright with birthday excitement. Mom. It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement, flat and unwelcoming. "Happy birthday to Emma," I said, holding up the gift, trying to inject warmth into the chill that seemed to radiate from the doorframe. "I know I'm a little early, but I was hoping I could help with the party preparations. Maybe we could—" "You can't come in." The words hit me like a physical blow. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. "What do you mean? It's Emma's birthday. I'm her grandmother." Michael stepped onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind him. In the sudden quiet, I could still hear the children's laughter, but now it felt like it was coming from another world, a world I wasn't allowed to enter. "We've talked about this." His voice was steady, controlled, as if he'd rehearsed this moment. "Jennifer and I have decided it's better if the kids don't get confused by mixed messages." Mixed messages. I stared at my son, this man I'd raised from infancy, searching his face for any trace of the boy who used to run to me when he was scared, who'd curl up in my lap when thunderstorms rattled our small apartment windows. "I don't understand. What mixed messages? I just want to see my grandchildren." "Look, Mom." He shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at the door as if someone might be listening. "Jennifer's parents are here. They help with school pickups, babysitting, family vacations. They're involved. They contribute. You show up with homemade gifts and want to tell stories about the old days. It's confusing for the kids." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "The old days? You mean your childhood?" "I mean the past. Look, I've built something here. A good life. A stable life. And I need the kids to understand what success looks like, what they should aspire to." The gift box felt suddenly heavy in my hands. Through its wrapping, I could feel the soft wool of the sweater I'd spent 3 weeks knitting, working by lamplight after my shifts at the diner, choosing each stitch with love. "And I don't represent success?" I asked quietly. He looked away. "You represent struggle, sacrifice, making do with less. That's not the lesson I want them to learn." Inside the house, Emma's voice rose above the others. "Daddy, when is Nana Sarah coming? You said she might come to my party." Michael's face hardened. "She's not coming, sweetheart. Remember? We talked about this." Something cracked inside my chest. Not broken, but cracked, like ice beginning to shift. "You told her I wasn't coming?" "I told her you were busy." "Which is true, isn't it? You work all the time." "I work so I can live, so I can be independent, so I won't be a burden to anyone." The words came out sharper than I intended, and I saw him flinch. "Look, this isn't easy for me either," he said, but there was no warmth in his voice. "But Jennifer's right. The kids need consistency. They need to see what stability looks like." Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Jennifer's mother arranging flowers on the kitchen counter. She wore a cream-colored blouse that probably cost more than I made in a week. Her jewelry caught the light as she moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd never wondered if she could afford groceries. "Your grandchildren love you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Emma still talks about the stories I used to tell her. Tommy asks for my pancakes every time he visits." "Used to," Michael said. "That's the point. They're getting older. They need to focus on their future, not get attached to the way things used to be." I looked down at the gift in my hands, then back at my son. "What happened to you, Michael? When did love become something to be rationed?" He opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. For just a moment I saw something flicker across his face, uncertainty, maybe even pain, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "I'm sorry, Mom, I really am, but this is how it has to be." He stepped back toward the door, and I knew this conversation was over. Not resolved. Over. Can I at least give Emma her gift? He shook his head. It would just confuse things. The door closed with a soft click, but it sounded as final as a gunshot. I stood on that porch for a long time, holding my granddaughter's birthday present and listening to the sounds of a party I wasn't allowed to attend. Somewhere inside that house, my grandchildren were growing up without me, being taught that love was conditional, that family was something you could discard when it no longer served your image. If you like emotional stories like this one, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here. And tell me, from which city are you watching? Because no matter where you are, I know there's someone who understands exactly how this feels. The walk back to my car felt like the longest journey of my life. In my rearview mirror, I could see the balloons still dancing in the afternoon breeze, cheerful and bright against the gray sky of my heartbreak. But as I drove away, something unexpected settled in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter, something that whispered, "This isn't over." A mother's love doesn't end at a doorstep. It finds a way. The weeks that followed blurred together like pages torn from a calendar. I kept my phone close, checking for messages that never came. No thank you for the sweater I'd left on their doorstep. No photos of Emma wearing it. No acknowledgement that I existed at all. I tried calling twice. The first time, Michael answered with that careful, polite voice he used with telemarketers. "Hi, Mom. I was hoping we could talk," I said, gripping the phone tighter than necessary. "Maybe I could take the kids for ice cream this weekend, just for an hour. This weekend's not good. Jennifer's parents are visiting, and we've got family plans." Family plans. The word stung because I understood their true meaning. Family plans that didn't include me. What about next weekend? "I'll have to check our schedule and get back to you." He never got back to me. The second call went straight to voicemail. I listened to his recorded voice, cheerful and warm for everyone except me, and hung up without leaving a message. What was the point? I started noticing things I'd missed before. When I drove past their neighborhood grocery store, I'd sometimes see Jennifer's mother loading bags into her car, obviously coming from their house. She'd wave at other shoppers, smile at the cashiers, move through the world with the easy confidence of someone who belonged everywhere she went. I wondered if she knew about me, if Michael had told her about the woman who used to matter in his life, who'd raised him through late-night fevers and homework struggles and teenage heartbreaks, or if I'd simply been erased from the family story, a chapter they'd decided was no longer worth reading. The holidays approached like a storm I could see coming but couldn't escape. October became November, and I found myself staring at the Thanksgiving decorations in store windows, remembering the years when Michael was small and we'd make turkey handprints together at our kitchen table, his tiny fingers covered in brown paint, giggling as I helped him press them onto construction paper. "Look, Mama, it's our turkey." He'd been so proud of those handprints. I still had them somewhere, tucked away in a box of memories that felt increasingly like evidence of a life I'd imagined, rather than lived. Jennifer's Facebook page became a source of torture I couldn't resist. Her photos showed their beautiful life in careful detail. Emma and Tommy carving pumpkins with Grandma and Grandpa, who weren't me. Family dinner preparations where Jennifer's mother wore an apron and smiled at the camera while stirring something in a pot that gleamed like new money. There were pictures of school events I didn't know about. Emma's Halloween costume, a princess, of course. Tommy's soccer game where he'd apparently scored his first goal. In the background of one photo, I could make out Jennifer's father cheering from the sidelines, his arms raised in celebration of a moment I would never know about. I closed the laptop feeling hollow. Not angry, not yet, just empty, like a house after the furniture's been moved out, and you can hear your footsteps echo in rooms that used to feel warm and full. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, started asking fewer questions about the grandchildren. At first, she'd inquire eagerly about Emma's school progress or Tommy's latest accomplishments. I'd deflect with vague answers, pretending privacy rather than admitting abandonment. "How are those beautiful grandchildren of yours?" she'd ask over the fence while tending her garden. "Growing so fast," I'd reply, which was true even if I wasn't there to witness it. But as weeks passed without new stories to share, without recent photos to show, Mrs. Chen's questions grew gentler and less frequent. She was kind enough not to pry, wise enough to recognize when someone was grieving a loss they couldn't fully explain. Work became my refuge. The diner where I'd waitressed for 6 years welcomed me with its familiar rhythms. Coffee refills, order taking, the gentle chaos of feeding people who appreciated simple kindness. My regulars knew me by name, asked about my day, left tips that suggested I mattered to someone, even if only for the length of a meal. "How's that grandson of yours doing in soccer?" asked Mr. Peterson, a retired teacher who came in every Tuesday for pie and coffee. I'd been telling him about Tommy's interest in sports for months, back when I still received updates, back when Michael would call to share small victories and funny stories. "He's doing well," I said, refilling his cup, though it was still half full. "Kids that age, they change so fast." Mr. Peterson nodded, but I caught him studying my face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades learning to read between the lines of what children, and adults, left unsaid. The truth was, I had no idea how Tommy was doing in soccer. For all I knew, he'd quit months ago, or made the all-star team, or discovered he hated the sport entirely. I was no longer privy to the small details that make up a child's world, no longer trusted with the ordinary moments that grandmothers were supposed to treasure and remember. At home, I found myself avoiding the guest bedroom where Emma and Tommy used to sleep when they visited. The twin beds still wore the sheets I'd bought specifically for them, soft cotton with patterns I'd thought they'd love. Emma's had butterflies, Tommy's had dinosaurs. Now they just looked sad and expectant, like a table set for guests who would never arrive. I'd started closing that door when I passed it in the hallway, not locked, just closed, as if keeping it shut might preserve whatever magic had once lived there, might protect those memories from the reality that they would never be refreshed or renewed. Sometimes, in the quiet evening hours, I'd catch myself setting the table for 3 instead of 1, muscle memory stronger than conscious thought. I'd stare at those extra plates and wonder when my body would finally accept what my mind already knew. I was no longer expecting anyone. The phone calls from well-meaning friends became harder to navigate. "When are those grandkids coming to visit again?" my old friend Louise would ask during our monthly check-ins. "Not sure yet," I'd say, which was true in the cruelest possible way. "Schedules are complicated these days." "Well, you make sure they know how lucky they are to have you," Louise would say with the confidence of someone whose own family still gathered willingly around her table. "I will," I'd promise, knowing it was a lie. The worst part wasn't the big absences, missing birthdays or holidays hurt, but they were discrete events with clear beginnings and endings. The worst part was the slow erosion of everyday connection, the gradual realization that I was no longer part of the casual fabric of their lives. I didn't know if Emma had lost any teeth lately, if Tommy still woke up from nightmares about monsters under his bed. I didn't know their new favorite songs or whether they'd outgrown the picture books we used to read together. They were growing and changing and becoming new versions of themselves, and I was missing all of it. Some nights, I'd lie in bed and wonder if they asked about me. If Emma ever said, "Why doesn't Nana Sarah come over anymore?" If Tommy noticed that his favorite pancake maker had disappeared from their lives without explanation. Or worse, if they didn't ask at all. If my absence had been absorbed so seamlessly into their routine that they barely remembered I'd ever been there. The thought kept me awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand how love could be so thoroughly one-sided, how someone could matter so completely to you while meaning so little to them. December arrived with the cruel brightness of holiday decorations and the promise of gatherings I wouldn't attend. I tried one more time, not because I expected different results, but because some part of me refused to stop being a mother, even to a son who no longer wanted one. I spent 3 days baking Emma's favorite sugar cookies, the ones shaped like stars and hearts that we used to make together. Her small hands would press the cookie cutters into the dough while I guided her fingers, flour dusting our clothes and laughter filling my kitchen. I could still see her concentration face, tongue poking out slightly, eyebrows drawn together in serious determination. The cookies turned out perfectly, golden edges, soft centers, decorated with the careful precision I'd learned from my own mother decades ago. I packed them in a tin with a note, "For Emma and Tommy, with love from Nana Sarah. I hope these taste as sweet as my memories of making them with you." I left the tin on their doorstep with a small wrapped box containing hand-knitted mittens for both children. Red ones for Emma, blue for Tommy, both with their initials embroidered in white thread. I'd worked on them during my break shifts at the diner, stealing moments between customers to create something that might remind them I still existed. The tin was still there when I drove by 3 hours later, and the next day. On the third day, It was gone. But I never knew if they'd taken it inside or simply thrown it away. The uncertainty felt worse than rejection. At least rejection was a response. I called the elementary school where Emma was in second grade. Maybe I could volunteer, help with reading groups or lunch duty. Maybe I could glimpse her in the hallway, see how tall she'd grown, whether she still wore her hair in the lopsided ponytails she insisted on doing herself. "I'm sorry," the secretary said after checking her computer. "We show that Emma Morrison's approved pickup list doesn't include you. For volunteer positions, we need approval from parents, and I don't see any forms from the Morrison family authorizing your involvement." Approved pickup list. As if I were a stranger who might kidnap my own granddaughter. As if the woman who'd taught her to tie her shoes and sing lullabies was now considered a security risk. "I'm her grandmother," I said, knowing it wouldn't matter. "I understand, but our policy requires written authorization from the custodial parents. You're welcome to have them contact us if they'd like to add you to Emma's approved contacts." They wouldn't contact the school. We both knew that. I started shopping for Christmas presents anyway, a ritual that felt both hopeful and masochistic. In the toy store, surrounded by other grandparents excitedly selecting gifts, I felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. I picked up a book for Emma, a collection of fairy tales with beautiful illustrations, then put it back. What was the point of buying gifts that would never be opened, love that would never be received? But I couldn't stop myself. I bought the book anyway, and a building set for Tommy that I thought might challenge his growing mind. I wrapped them carefully, wrote heartfelt cards explaining how proud I was of the amazing children they were becoming, and mailed them to their house with delivery confirmation so I'd know they arrived. The packages were delivered on December 15th at 2:47 p.m. I never heard a word about whether they were opened, appreciated, or thrown away unopened. The silence was its own form of cruelty. Jennifer's mother posted a photo on Christmas morning showing Emma and Tommy surrounded by beautifully wrapped gifts, their faces bright with excitement. In the background, I could see adults holding coffee cups and smiling indulgently. The picture was captioned, "Christmas magic with our precious grandchildren." As if she had given birth to Michael. As if she had earned the right to claim my grandchildren through 27 years of motherhood rather than marriage to their other grandmother. I stared at that word until my eyes burned, understanding that I had been completely replaced by someone who fit their image of what a grandmother should be. I tried showing up at Tommy's soccer game. I'd learned the schedule from the school website and drove 40 minutes to sit in the bleachers like any other grandmother supporting her grandson. I kept my distance, choosing a spot where I could see, but hopefully not cause drama. Tommy looked so much older than I remembered, his legs longer, his face more defined. He moved across the field with growing confidence, and when he scored a goal, my heart swelled with pride that had nowhere to go. I wanted to cheer, to call his name, to be the grandmother jumping to her feet with joy. Instead, I sat quietly and watched Jennifer's father do all the things I wanted to do. He shouted encouragement, took photos, gave Tommy thumbs up from the sidelines. When the game ended, I watched my grandson run toward the wrong grandfather for congratulations and celebration. I was gathering my courage to approach, maybe just to say hello and tell Tommy how proud I was, when Michael spotted me. The look on his face was pure fury. Not disappointment, not even annoyance, but actual anger that I had dared to exist in the same space as his family. He strode across the field with Jennifer close behind, both of them moving with the determined pace of people about to cause a scene. "What are you doing here?" Michael's voice was low but sharp, controlled in the way that suggested he was holding back something much uglier. "I wanted to see Tommy play," I said simply. "He's my grandson." "You need to leave. Now. I'm sitting in a public place watching my grandson's soccer game. I'm not bothering anyone." "You're bothering us," Jennifer said, speaking to me directly for the first time in months. "You're making everyone uncomfortable." I looked around the field, at the other parents and grandparents who were packing up their folding chairs and water bottles. None of them looked uncomfortable. Most weren't even paying attention to us. The discomfort was entirely theirs, and they were trying to make it my responsibility. "I just want to tell Tommy he played well," I said. "Absolutely not." Michael stepped between me and where Tommy was collecting his soccer ball, physically blocking my path to my own grandchild. "We've been clear about this. You showing up unannounced and uninvited is exactly the kind of behavior that proves we made the right decision." The logic was circular and cruel. They excluded me, so my attempts to maintain connection proved I deserved to be excluded. My love was evidence of my unworthiness to love. Please don't make this difficult, Jennifer added, her voice taking on the reasonable tone of someone who believed she was being generous. Think about what's best for the children, as if wanting to know my grandchildren was selfish, as if loving them was harmful, as if my presence in their lives would somehow damage them rather than enrich them. I left without speaking to Tommy, without congratulating him on his goal, without being able to be his grandmother even for 5 minutes. In my rearview mirror, I watched them redirect him toward the car, Jennifer's parents flanking him like protective guards, ensuring he wouldn't accidentally notice the woman who had been dismissed from his life. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote a letter I would never send. Page after page of everything I wanted to say to Michael, all the questions I wanted answered, all the hurt I wanted him to understand. Why wasn't I good enough? What had I done wrong? When had my love become something to be ashamed of? But even as I wrote, I knew the answers wouldn't satisfy me. The truth was simpler and more devastating than any explanation he might offer. I didn't fit the life he wanted to live. I was a reminder of struggle, of making do with less, of the years when love had to substitute for money and determination had to replace opportunity. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer with the others I'd written but never sent. Someday, maybe, I would find the courage to ask these questions out loud. Or maybe I would find something better than courage. Maybe I would find peace with being exactly who I had always been. A woman who loved completely, even when that love was unwanted. A grandmother whose heart knew no conditions, even when her family imposed them. A mother who had raised a son to be successful, even if that success meant she was no longer welcome in his world. But sitting in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by the silence of a life suddenly made smaller, I felt something new stirring beneath the hurt. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of clarity I hadn't expected. They could exclude me from their gatherings, ignore my gifts, pretend I didn't exist. But they couldn't change the truth of who I was, or erase the love that had shaped their lives, even if they no longer valued it. That realization should have brought comfort. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something I wasn't quite ready to name. January came with the brutal honesty of a fresh calendar year. No more holidays to anticipate, no more excuses to reach out, no more reasons to hope for invitations that wouldn't come. Just the stark reality of days stretching ahead without the children who had once given them meaning. I stopped checking Michael's social media. The constant updates about their perfect life had become a form of self-torture I finally had the wisdom to abandon. Every photo of family dinners I wasn't invited to, every image of grandmother-grandchild activities that excluded me, felt like pressing on a bruise just to confirm it still hurt. The diner offered extra shifts, and I took them all. Work became my sanctuary, the only place where I felt useful, needed, appreciated for something I could actually provide. Mrs. Rodriguez came in every Thursday morning for coffee and wheat toast, and she always asked about my day with genuine interest. Mr. Kim saved his crossword puzzles for me to help him with, claiming I was better with words than anyone else he knew. These small interactions became precious to me. Brief moments where I mattered to someone, where my presence added value rather than causing discomfort. At work, I was Sarah, the reliable waitress. Sarah, who remembered how you liked your coffee. Sarah, who always had a kind word when you needed one. At work, I existed. At home, I began to disappear. I stopped cooking real meals, subsisting instead on toast and soup, simple foods that required no planning or hope for tomorrow. The kitchen table where I'd once imagined future holiday dinners with Emma and Tommy became a place where I simply paid bills and sorted mail, its potential for joy quietly abandoned. I took down the photos of the grandchildren that had lined my hallway, not in anger, but because seeing their faces every day was like tending to a wound that needed time to heal. I wrapped each frame carefully in tissue paper and placed them in a box, the same box where I kept their handmade cards and the drawings Emma used to give me. Stick figures labeled me and Nana in crayon letters that still made my chest tight with loss. The guest bedroom remained closed. I'd started avoiding that entire side of the house, as if staying away might preserve whatever energy their presence had left behind. Sometimes I'd catch myself listening for sounds that would never come. The patter of small feet on hardwood floors, whispered conversations between siblings sharing a room, the particular silence of children sleeping safely under my roof. My phone, once a source of hope and disappointment in equal measure, became simply a practical tool. I turned off notifications, stopped jumping every time it buzzed with messages from telemarketers or automated reminders. The silence I'd once dreaded became oddly comforting, free from the constant possibility of disappointment. Mrs. Chen stopped asking about the grandchildren altogether. Instead, she began bringing me vegetables from her garden, tomatoes in summer, squash in fall, preserves she'd canned from fruit trees that produced more than one person could consume. Her kindness was wordless but profound, the generosity of someone who understood that sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is simply notice when someone is struggling and respond with practical care. I started spending Sundays at the library, not because I needed to use their computers or services, but because the quiet presence of other people felt less lonely than my empty house. I'd choose books I might never finish, sit in comfortable chairs surrounded by the gentle sounds of pages turning and keyboards clicking, and remember what it felt like to be part of a community, even a temporary one. The children's section was both a comfort and a torment. I'd watch grandparents reading to small children, their voices animated with the joy of shared stories, and feel the phantom weight of Emma and Tommy in my lap, their warm bodies pressed against mine while we explored magical worlds together. One Sunday in March, I overheard a grandmother telling her grandson about her own childhood, painting word pictures of a simpler time when children played outside until dark, and families gathered for Sunday dinners, without the distraction of phones or busy schedules. The little boy listened with wide eyes, absorbing family history that would become part of his identity, stories that would connect him to something larger than his immediate world. I realized with sudden, sharp clarity what was being stolen from my grandchildren, not just my presence, but their own history. Emma and Tommy would grow up knowing only one version of their family's story, the sanitized narrative that began with Michael's success and Jennifer's family's approval. They wouldn't know about the grandmother who'd worked 2 jobs to buy Michael's school clothes, who'd stayed up all night when he had pneumonia at age 6, who'd taught him to ride a bike in the parking lot behind our apartment building because we didn't have a yard. They wouldn't know where Michael's stubborn determination came from, or his ability to find solutions when resources were scarce. They wouldn't understand that his drive to succeed had been built on a foundation of my struggles, my sacrifices, my unwavering belief that he could become anything he dreamed of becoming. They would know about trust funds and private schools, about grandparents who could afford family vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. But they wouldn't know about the grandmother who'd made Christmas magical with creativity instead of money, who'd turned cardboard boxes into castles and taught them that love was the most valuable gift anyone could receive. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and made a decision that surprised me with its calm certainty. I opened the box where I kept their drawings and cards, not to torture myself with memories, but to really look at them for the first time since the exclusion began. Emma's drawing of our family, stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, everyone smiling with crooked circles for heads and 2 long arms that reached toward each other with obvious affection. Tommy's Father's Day card where he'd dictated words for me to help him spell. Dear Daddy, Nana Sarah says you are the best daddy in the world because she made you that way. I had evidence of love that predated their parents' decision to erase me. I had proof of relationships that had been real and meaningful and formative, regardless of their current status. I had documentation of a grandmother who had mattered, at least for a while. But more than that, I had something they didn't know about, something I'd kept safe all these years, something that connected me to Emma and Tommy in a way that couldn't be severed by parental decree or social exclusion. I'd kept every story, not just the ones I'd told them, but the ones about them. Every funny thing they'd said, every milestone they'd reached, every moment of wonder or discovery or pure childhood joy that I'd witnessed. I'd written it all down in a journal I'd started the day Emma was born, a record of their growing up that existed independently of their parents' documentation. Their first words, their favorite foods, the songs that made them dance, the books that made them laugh, the questions that revealed how their minds worked. I had captured all of it in my own words, from my own perspective, with my own love coloring every observation. Michael and Jennifer had photos and videos, official records and school achievements, but I had something different, the story of who Emma and Tommy really were when no one was watching but their grandmother. The story of children who'd been loved unconditionally, who'd been seen and celebrated for exactly who they were, rather than who they might become. I pulled out the journal and began reading entries from years past, my handwriting documenting moments that felt like treasures now. Emma spent an hour today arranging all her stuffed animals by size, then by color, then by how much she loved them. The last category changed every 5 minutes. Tommy asked me if clouds have dreams. When I said I didn't know, he said, "I think they dream about being rain." These were the stories that belonged to me, that couldn't be taken away or dismissed or replaced. These were the memories that proved I hadn't imagined the love, hadn't invented the connection, hadn't misunderstood my importance in their lives. Sitting there in the quiet of my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of love that had been real and deep and mutual, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope. That felt too fragile, too dangerous, but something steadier, something that whispered a truth I was finally ready to hear. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. The journal became my companion during the long spring evenings, page after page of memories I'd carefully preserved, moments that revealed not just who Emma and Tommy had been as small children, but who I had been as their grandmother. Reading my own words, I began to remember a version of myself I'd almost forgotten. Today, Emma asked me why I always hum when I cook. I told her it's because food tastes better when it's made with music. She spent the rest of the afternoon humming while she colored, creating her own soundtrack for art. I'd written that 3 years ago, when life still included Sunday afternoon visits, and children who sought my wisdom about everything from why the sky was blue to whether angels had favorite colors. I traced my fingers over the words, remembering the woman who'd believed that every question deserved a thoughtful answer, who'd seen magic in ordinary moments, who'd understood that being a grandmother meant being a keeper of wonder. That woman had been confident in her love, secure in her importance, unashamed of the joy she found in simple things. When had I started apologizing for who I was? The question surfaced during a quiet Tuesday morning shift at the diner. Mr. Peterson was reading his newspaper, occasionally sharing interesting headlines with me as I refilled his coffee. Mrs. Martinez was working on her weekly crossword puzzle, muttering Spanish words under her breath when she got stuck. The familiar rhythm of their routines felt comfortable, predictable in the best possible way. "Sarah," Mrs. Martinez said, looking up from her puzzle, "what's a 7-letter word for inner strength?" "Courage," I replied automatically, then paused. "Actually, maybe resolve." She tried both words, nodding with satisfaction when the letters fit. "Resolve. That's good. Sometimes we don't know we have it until we need it." Her casual observation hit me with unexpected force. For months, I'd been thinking of myself as a victim of circumstances beyond my control, a woman whose love had been deemed insufficient by people who mattered more than she did. But reading my journal entries, I was rediscovering evidence of a different woman entirely. I'd been Sarah, who made snow angels with grandchildren on winter mornings when their parents were too busy or too tired. Sarah, who taught Emma to braid friendship bracelets and helped Tommy build elaborate block cities that covered my entire living room floor. Sarah, who'd created traditions and memories and moments of pure joy out of nothing more expensive than time and attention. That Sarah hadn't been apologetic about her modest home or her second-hand furniture. She'd been proud of the sanctuary she'd created, the space where children felt free to be messy and loud and completely themselves. She'd understood that love wasn't about providing the most expensive gifts, but about providing presence, patience, and the kind of unconditional acceptance that allowed children to flourish. I started carrying myself differently, not with defiance. That would have been reactive, dependent on others for its energy. Instead, I moved through my days with growing awareness of my own worth, my own story, my own right to exist without apology. At the grocery store, I stopped avoiding the toy aisle where I used to browse for small surprises for Emma and Tommy. Instead, I walked through it deliberately, remembering the joy I'd felt in choosing perfect gifts, not because they were expensive, but because they were chosen with intimate knowledge of what would delight each child. I'd known that Emma preferred books with strong female characters, and Tommy loved anything he could take apart and put back together. That knowledge had value that couldn't be replaced by money or status. I began writing again, but not letters I'd never send. I started adding new entries to my journal, documenting not just memories, but observations about the woman I was rediscovering, the grandmother who'd never needed permission to love, who'd never questioned her right to matter in children's lives, who'd understood that family was about connection rather than convenience. I realize I've been grieving not just the loss of Emma and Tommy, but the loss of myself as their grandmother, as if their absence meant I never truly held that role at all. But love doesn't work that way. The woman who taught Emma to see shapes in clouds still exists. The grandmother who helped Tommy plant seeds in paper cups and watch them grow still knows how to nurture growing things. They can exclude my presence, but they can't erase my past. Writing those words felt like coming home to myself. I called my old friend Louise, not to make excuses for my grandchildren's absence, but to tell her honestly what had happened. The conversation I'd been dreading became liberating in its simplicity. "They've decided to cut me out of the children's lives," I said without preamble when she asked about Emma and Tommy. Louise was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's their loss, and it's wrong." And no elaborate explanations required, no justifications for my worthiness as a grandmother, just simple acknowledgement that what was happening to me was unjust, and that the fault lay with them, not with me. "How are you handling it?" she asked. "I'm remembering who I am," I said, surprising myself with the confidence in my voice. "I'm remembering that being a grandmother isn't something they can give me or take away. It's something I became the day Emma was born, something that exists independent of their permission." That conversation opened something inside me that had been locked tight for months. I started reaching out to other parts of my life that had nothing to do with Michael or his family. I volunteered at the local literacy center, reading with adults who were learning to navigate written words for the first time. Their determination reminded me that growth and learning never stop, that setbacks don't define futures. I joined Mrs. Chen in her garden, learning about plants that bloomed despite harsh conditions, vegetables that grew stronger when stressed by drought or frost. There were lessons in her quiet wisdom about resilience, about the difference between surviving and thriving. "Some plants need difficult seasons," she told me as we transplanted seedlings that had outgrown their containers. "Makes them develop deeper roots, stronger stems. They become plants that last." I thought about Emma and Tommy often, but the quality of my thoughts began to change. Instead of focusing on their absence, I started appreciating the gift of having loved them so completely, even if only for a few precious years. The time we'd shared hadn't been stolen or invalidated by what came after. Those memories belonged to me as much as to them, and no one could revise or diminish their significance. I began to understand something that had eluded me during the worst of my pain. I hadn't failed as a grandmother. I'd been dismissed by people who measured worth by different standards, who valued appearances over authenticity, who'd chosen comfort over truth. Their choice said nothing about my capacity to love or my worthiness to be loved. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. The woman who emerged from those months of reflection was familiar, yet transformed, still tender-hearted, still devoted to the children who'd been taken from her life, but no longer diminished by their absence. I'd rediscovered the grandmother who'd always known that love was its own reward, that the privilege of caring for children was a gift that couldn't be revoked by administrative decision. I kept writing in the journal, but now I included plans alongside memories, ideas for the future that didn't depend on others' permission or approval, dreams that belonged entirely to me. And sometimes, late at night when the house was particularly quiet, I allowed myself to imagine a different possibility, not reconciliation. That felt too much like hoping for something outside my control, but something else, something that honored both my love for Emma and Tommy and my respect for my own worth, something that whispered that this story wasn't over, that love as deep and authentic as mine had a way of finding its destination, even when all the obvious paths had been blocked. I wasn't planning anything dramatic or manipulative. I wasn't plotting revenge or scheming to force my way back into lives that had rejected me. But I was no longer accepting that exclusion was permanent or that my relationship with my grandchildren was entirely at the mercy of their parents' preferences. I was simply becoming ready for whatever came next, grounded in the knowledge of who I had always been and confident in the value of what I had to offer. Whether that opportunity came or not was beyond my control, but I would be ready for it. The letter arrived on a Thursday in late September, mixed in with bills and grocery store circulars like any other piece of mail. But the moment I saw the return address, Emma's elementary school, my heart began beating in a rhythm I'd almost forgotten. Not hope exactly, but anticipation. The feeling that something was shifting in the careful distance Michael and Jennifer had constructed around my grandchildren's lives. I set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for 20 minutes before finding the courage to open it. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, weighted with possibilities I couldn't predict or control. Inside, a single sheet of official school letterhead bore a message that changed everything. Dear family members, we are excited to invite you to our annual Grandparents' Day celebration on October 15th. Students have been working hard to prepare special presentations about their family histories, and we hope you can join us to see their wonderful work. Please reply by October 10th if you plan to attend. We look forward to celebrating the special relationships between children and their grandparents. The words blurred as I read them a second time, then a third. Someone at Emma's school had sent this invitation to all family members, not just the approved ones. Someone had included me in the automatic mailing list, probably without realizing they were opening a door that had been deliberately closed. Grandparents' Day. Emma would be expecting her real grandparents, Jennifer's parents who attended every school event, who knew her teachers' names and understood the complex social dynamics of second-grade friendships. She wouldn't be expecting me, probably didn't even remember that I existed in any meaningful way. But the invitation was addressed to the Morrison family, and despite everything that had happened, I was still technically part of that family, at least legally, at least according to whoever maintained the school's mailing list. I called the school the next morning, my hands shaking as I dialed the number printed at the bottom of the invitation. Lincoln Elementary. This is Maria speaking. Hi, Maria. I received an invitation to Grandparents' Day, and I wanted to confirm my attendance. Wonderful. What's your student's name? Emma Morrison, 2nd grade. I heard typing, then a brief pause. Oh, I see there are already 2 grandparents registered for Emma. Are you perhaps a step-grandparent or... I'm her father's mother, I said quietly. Emma's paternal grandmother. Of course. I'll add you to the list. We love when children have multiple grandparents who want to be involved. Emma will be so excited. Would she? Or would my appearance cause exactly the kind of scene Michael had been trying to avoid? I didn't know, but for the first time in months, uncertainty felt better than the crushing certainty of exclusion. I spent the weekend in a strange state of nervous preparation, not planning what I would say or do, that felt too much like plotting, but simply getting ready to exist in the same space as my granddaughter after almost a year of separation. I chose my clothes carefully. A soft blue dress that Emma had once said made me look pretty like a flower. Comfortable shoes that would let me sit on the floor if story time required it. The small pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I practiced conversations in my mirror, trying to find words that were honest but not accusatory, loving but not desperate. What do you say to a child who's been taught that you don't matter anymore? How do you explain absence without creating blame? How do you love someone who may not remember why that love is precious? The night before Grandparents' Day, I couldn't sleep. Instead, I sat with my journal open to a fresh page and wrote the letter I would never send. The words I wanted Emma to know, but couldn't say in a crowded classroom surrounded by other families and curious observers. My dearest Emma, tomorrow I will see you for the first time in so long. I don't know if you'll remember the grandmother who used to read you stories and help you bake cookies that never turned out quite right because we were too busy laughing to follow the recipe properly. I don't know if you'll remember the woman who taught you to see animals and cloud formations and helped you plant marigold seeds in paper cups that we lined up on my kitchen windowsill. But I remember everything. Every scraped knee I kissed better. Every bedtime story I told in the voices you requested. Every moment of wonder when you discovered something new about the world. I remember the little girl who insisted that butterflies were flowers that learned to fly, who asked me if stars were holes in the sky where heaven's light leaked through. I am still that grandmother, Emma, changed by missing you, sadder for the time we've lost, but still the woman who loves you more than words can hold. Tomorrow, I will sit in your classroom and be proud of the amazing person you're becoming, even though I haven't been allowed to witness most of that becoming. I will cheer for your presentation and marvel at how much you've grown and try not to cry when I realize how much of your childhood I've been forced to miss. I don't expect anything from you, sweetheart. I don't need you to remember or acknowledge or choose me. I just need you to know that love doesn't disappear when someone tells it to go away. It waits. It endures. It remains faithful even when faithfulness feels foolish. I will always be your Nana Sarah, whether anyone wants me to be or not. Some things are true whether they're spoken aloud or not. Writing those words felt like preparing for battle, but a different kind of battle than I'd ever fought before. Not a battle against Michael and Jennifer, not a struggle to force my way back into lives that had rejected me. This was a battle for my own right to love authentically, to exist honestly, to be the grandmother I had always been, regardless of whether that role was officially recognized or welcomed. I closed the journal and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring either a small victory or a devastating defeat, but no longer afraid of either possibility. I had found something in those months of exile that was more valuable than approval. I had found myself. Friday morning dawned clear and cool, perfect October weather that made everything look crisp and full of possibility. I dressed carefully, ate breakfast, though my stomach churned with nerves, and drove to Lincoln Elementary with the slow, deliberate pace of someone approaching a moment that would define everything that came after. The school parking lot buzzed with activity. Grandparents walked hand in hand with excited children, carrying coffee cups and cameras, moving with the easy confidence of people who belonged. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching them, remembering what it felt like to be part of that casual intimacy between generations. Through the school's main windows, I could see colorful displays lining the hallways, student artwork celebrating family connections and generational love. Somewhere inside that building, Emma was probably putting finishing touches on whatever presentation she'd prepared, nervous and excited about sharing her family history with the adults who mattered most to her. I wondered if she'd mentioned me in her project, if somewhere in her display of family photos and stories there was evidence of a grandmother who used to matter, or if I'd been edited out so completely that her family tree showed only branches that led to people who still had permission to love her. The morning bell rang, and the parade of grandparents began moving toward the entrance. I took a deep breath, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time, and joined them. Not because I expected to be welcomed, not because I thought my presence would solve anything, but because I was Emma's grandmother, and sometimes being true to who you are requires courage more than permission. I signed in at the front desk, noting that my name was indeed on the list, official and legitimate despite everything that had happened. The secretary smiled at me with genuine warmth, handed me a visitor's badge, and directed me toward Emma's classroom. As I walked down the hallway decorated with children's artwork and family photos, past bulletin boards celebrating the special bond between grandparents and grandchildren, I felt something I hadn't experienced in almost a year. I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, regardless of whether anyone else agreed, and somehow, that feeling was enough to carry me forward into whatever waited around the corner. Emma's classroom door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap I could hear children's voices mixing with adult laughter. I paused in the hallway, my hand resting on the door frame, gathering courage for whatever lay beyond. The visitor's badge felt heavy on my chest, official permission to exist in a space where I'd been unwelcome for so long. I stepped inside and immediately saw her. Emma stood at the front of the classroom next to a poster board covered with photos and drawings, her hair longer than I remembered, her face more mature, but still carrying traces of the toddler who used to demand one more story every night. She was explaining something about family traditions to a circle of seated grandparents, her voice confident and clear. "And every Sunday, we have breakfast with Grandma Pat and Grandpa Jim," she was saying, pointing to a photo of Jennifer's parents. "They take us to restaurants with white tablecloths, and Grandma Pat always orders fresh flowers for the table." My heart clenched, but not with the sharp pain I'd expected. Instead, I felt something gentler, a bittersweet recognition of the life she was living, the grandparents who were creating memories I couldn't provide. They weren't replacing what we'd had. They were offering something entirely different, and that was okay. Emma continued her presentation, describing family vacations and holiday traditions, school pickups, and weekend activities. Everything she shared painted a picture of stability, abundance, and love. Even in my exclusion, I felt proud of the secure childhood she was experiencing. Then her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed me standing near the back of the room. "Oh, wonderful. It looks like we have another grandmother here." She smiled warmly and gestured toward me. "Emma, would you like to introduce your other visitor?" Emma followed Mrs. Patterson's gaze, and her eyes met mine across the crowded classroom. For a moment, time suspended itself. I saw recognition flicker across her face, confusion, surprise, and something that might have been memory stirring to life. Nana Sarah? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden quiet of the room, everyone heard it. I felt every adult's attention turned toward me, including the sharp, shocked stare of Jennifer's parents from their seats in the front row, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the way Emma's face was changing as she looked at me, as if she was remembering not just my appearance but the feeling of being loved by me. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "I hope it's okay that I came to hear about your family project." Emma glanced toward Jennifer's parents, then back to me, clearly uncertain about the social dynamics she couldn't fully understand. But then she smiled, tentative but real, and I saw the little girl who used to run to me with scraped knees and exciting discoveries. "Do you want to see my family tree?" she asked, pointing to her poster board. I moved closer, aware that every conversation in the room had stopped, that curious grandparents and watchful teachers were observing this unexpected reunion. But Emma's focus was entirely on her project, and mine was entirely on her. "Tell me about it," I said, kneeling down to her level the way I always had when she wanted to share something important. She began describing the photos again, but this time with more detail, more enthusiasm. As she talked, I noticed something that made my breath catch. Tucked in one corner of her poster, almost hidden behind a larger photo, was a small picture I recognized. It was one of Emma and me from 2 years ago, both of us covered in flour and laughing at some baking disaster we'd created together. "Emma," I said gently, pointing to the photo, "where did this come from?" She followed my gaze and her cheeks flushed pink. "I found it in my room," she admitted quietly. I remembered making cookies with you, and how you always let me lick the spoon even though Mommy says that's not safe because of raw eggs." The simple honesty of her memory hit me harder than any dramatic reunion could have. She had remembered. Despite months of separation, despite her parents' efforts to redirect her attention toward other relationships, some part of her had held on to the grandmother who'd made baking an adventure rather than a chore. "I keep it under my pillow sometimes," she whispered, leaning closer so only I could hear. When I miss how things used to be." That's when I understood what was happening in this classroom wasn't really about me. It was about Emma, a little girl who'd been carrying questions she didn't know how to ask, missing someone she'd been told not to think about, trying to make sense of why love sometimes disappears without explanation. "Emma, honey," I said carefully, "do you know why I stopped coming to visit?" She shook her head, her eyes serious and searching. "It's complicated," I admitted, "but it was never because I stopped loving you. Some grown-ups make decisions that are hard for children to understand, and sometimes those decisions mean people who love each other very much can't spend time together. But love doesn't go away just because someone isn't around." Jennifer's mother stood up abruptly from her seat, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "but I think there's been some confusion here. Emma's family relationships are quite clear, and this disruption isn't appropriate for a school setting." The classroom fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of children playing at recess. Every pair of adult eyes was now focused on what had become an uncomfortable public drama, exactly the kind of scene Michael and Jennifer had been trying to prevent. But before I could respond, before I could apologize and retreat to avoid making things worse for Emma, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Patterson, Emma's teacher, stepped forward with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating family complications in educational settings. "I'm sorry," she said firmly but kindly, "but this is Emma's family presentation, and she gets to decide who she wants to include in her family story. Every child has the right to acknowledge all the people who have loved them, regardless of current family dynamics." Then Emma herself, with the startling clarity that children sometimes possess in moments of adult confusion, made the decision that silenced everyone in the room. "She is my Nana Sarah," Emma said, her voice stronger now, more certain. "She taught me how to make pancakes that look like animals and how to tell which stars are really planets. She's part of my family even if she doesn't come to dinner anymore." The simplicity of her declaration cut through all the adult complications and social maneuvering. This 8-year-old girl had just defined family not by proximity or convenience or approval, but by love and memory, and the indelible impact people have on each other's lives. Jennifer's mother sat down heavily, apparently realizing that creating a bigger scene would only make things worse. The other grandparents resumed their conversations, but with the subdued awareness that they'd witnessed something more complex than a typical family celebration. Emma turned back to her poster and continued describing her project, but now she included the corner photo in her presentation. She told the room about a grandmother who'd made baking an adventure, who'd taught her to see shapes in clouds, who'd created traditions around simple pleasures and everyday magic. As she spoke, I realized that this wasn't really about my return to her life. This was about Emma reclaiming parts of herself that she'd been asked to forget, asserting her right to love all the people who'd shaped her, regardless of adult politics or social pressures. When her presentation ended, Emma hugged me with the fierce intensity of someone who'd been holding back feelings too big for her small body. "I missed you, Nana Sarah," she whispered against my shoulder. "I didn't understand why you went away." "I missed you too, sweetheart," I whispered back. More than you could ever know. The day hadn't restored my place in Emma's regular life. It hadn't resolved the fundamental conflict between her parents' wishes and my love for her, but it had accomplished something perhaps more important. It had given Emma permission to remember, to acknowledge, to love without shame or confusion, and it had given me something I'd thought was lost forever, the certainty that our connection had been real, that my love had mattered, that being her grandmother was a truth no one could revise or erase. Walking out of that classroom, I felt the weight of months of grief lifting from my shoulders, not because everything was fixed, but because the most important truth had been spoken aloud by the person who mattered most. Emma still knew who I was. The phone rang that evening while I was making tea, the simple chamomile ritual that had become my way of processing difficult days. I let it ring twice before answering, no longer jumping at every call with desperate hope or dreaded anticipation. "Mom." Michael's voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the controlled authority he'd wielded during our previous conversations. "We need to talk." "Yes," I said simply, settling into my kitchen chair with my steaming mug. "I suppose we do." There was a long pause, filled with the weight of everything we'd avoided saying for almost a year. When he finally spoke, his words carried a heaviness I hadn't heard since he was a child, confessing to some misdeed he wasn't sure how to fix. "Jennifer's mother called. She told me what happened at the school today." "I'm sure she did. She said Emma asked for you, that she had your photo hidden in her project." I waited, understanding that this conversation would unfold at his pace, not mine. The woman who'd spent months pleading for explanations had been replaced by someone who knew her own worth and didn't need to defend it. "I didn't know," he said finally, "about the photo, about Emma asking questions. Jennifer said the kids were adjusting fine, that they'd moved on." "Children don't move on from love, Michael. They just learn when they're not supposed to talk about it." Another long silence. In the background, I could hear the distant sounds of his household, a television playing, Jennifer talking to someone, the ordinary evening rhythms of a family preparing for tomorrow, life continuing despite the complications he was trying to navigate. "I thought I was protecting them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "from confusion, from having to choose between different versions of what family should look like. And now? Now, I don't know what I was protecting them from. You were never the problem, Mom. You know that, right? You reminded me of things I wanted them not to have to worry about. Struggle, making do with less. I wanted them to grow up secure, confident that they'd always have enough." I took a sip of tea, tasting the gentle bitterness of herbs that needed time to steep properly, like truth that needed patience to reveal its full flavor. "You did give them security, Michael. You gave them opportunities I could never have provided. Private schools, family vacations, grandparents who can help with college funds and career connections. Those are gifts, not mistakes. But I took away something else, didn't I? I took away the grandmother who taught them that love doesn't require expensive gifts, that being valued doesn't depend on what you can afford to give." For the first time in our conversation, I heard something that sounded like the boy I'd raised, the child who'd once possessed an instinctive sense of fairness, who'd cried when other kids were excluded from games, who'd insisted on sharing his Halloween candy with neighbors who hadn't been able to afford costumes. "Emma asked me tonight why she couldn't see you anymore," he continued. "She said you used to tell her stories about when I was little, stories that made her laugh. She wanted to know if those stories were true, if I really used to be afraid of butterflies and whether I still sang in the shower." Despite everything, I smiled at the memory. You did sing in the shower, usually off-key, usually songs you'd made up about whatever you were excited about that day. I remember. His voice was softer now, touched with something that might have been nostalgia or regret or simply the recognition of time that couldn't be recovered. I remember a lot of things I thought I'd moved past. Moving past and moving forward are different things, I said gently. You can honor where you came from and still build the life you want for your children. Those things don't have to cancel each other out. What followed was the conversation we should have had months ago, before exclusion and hurt feelings had calcified into permanent positions. Michael told me about the pressure he felt to provide his children with everything he'd lacked, the fear that any reminder of struggle might somehow diminish their confidence in his ability to protect them from hardship. I told him about the months of silence, the grief that had felt like losing him twice, once when he'd become successful enough to be embarrassed by me, and again when he'd decided that embarrassment was more important than his children's right to know their grandmother. We talked about Jennifer's parents, who weren't villains in this story but simply people who fit more easily into the life Michael was building. They could offer things I couldn't: financial stability, social connections, the kind of effortless belonging that comes from never having to worry about whether you're good enough for the spaces you occupy. But they can't offer what you can, Michael admitted. They can't tell Emma and Tommy stories about resilience, about making magic out of ordinary moments, about the kind of love that doesn't depend on circumstances. 3 weeks later, Emma called me herself. Her voice on the phone was excited, nervous, and achingly familiar. The same tone she'd used when she was 4 and wanted to tell me about a butterfly she'd seen, or a new word she'd learned to spell. Nana Sarah? Daddy said I could invite you to my Halloween costume parade at school. It's next Friday at 2 o'clock, and I'm going to be a librarian because I decided that's the best job in the world because you get to read all day and help people find exactly the right story. My heart swelled with pride and recognition. This was the granddaughter I remembered. Thoughtful, imaginative, someone who saw magic in ordinary professions and found wisdom in unexpected places. I would love to come to your costume parade, I told her. A librarian sounds like the perfect choice for someone as smart and kind as you. Will you sit with Grandma Pat and Grandpa Jim? Daddy said it would be okay if you want to. He said you're all my family, and families can figure out how to share special days. That's how I found myself sitting beside Jennifer's parents at an elementary school Halloween parade, sharing space we'd never imagined we'd have to navigate together. It was awkward at first, careful politeness covering deeper uncertainties about roles and boundaries, and how to love the same children from different perspectives. But as we watched Emma march past in her carefully constructed librarian costume, complete with a cardigan she'd borrowed from Jennifer and glasses frames with no lenses that she'd found at a thrift store, something shifted. We were all there for the same reason, moved by the same fierce tenderness toward a little girl who deserved to be celebrated by everyone who loved her. She talks about you sometimes, Jennifer's mother admitted quietly as we watched Emma wave at us from the parade line. The stories you used to tell her, the traditions you taught her, I can see why those memories matter to her. It wasn't friendship, but it was recognition. Acknowledgement that love doesn't have to be competitive, that children are capable of holding space for multiple relationships without confusion or disloyalty. 6 months later, I have a new rhythm in my life, not the restoration of what was lost. That relationship died when it was rejected. And some things can't be resurrected unchanged, but something different, something built on honesty rather than assumption, boundaries rather than ownership. I see Emma and Tommy twice a month, usually for a few hours on Sunday afternoons. We bake cookies that still turn out imperfectly, because we're more interested in conversation than precision. We read stories and work jigsaw puzzles and take walks where Tommy collects interesting rocks, and Emma practices the art of seeing shapes in clouds. Michael and Jennifer have their lives, their routines, their ways of raising children that don't require my input or approval. Jennifer's parents continue to be the grandparents who attend every school event, who provide stability and abundance and the kind of consistent presence that children need to feel secure. But I am the grandmother who remembers, who keeps the stories of where they came from, who teaches them that love doesn't require perfection, who shows them that resilience and joy can coexist in the same person, in the same family, in the same moment. I still work at the diner, still volunteer at the literacy center, still tend Mrs. Chen's garden when she needs extra hands. I've discovered that a life built around your own worth rather than others' approval has a different quality. Steadier, more authentic, less vulnerable to the shifting opinions of people who love conditionally. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and I'm writing in my journal, I think about the woman I was a year ago, desperate for inclusion, willing to accept scraps of attention, measuring her value by other people's willingness to make room for her. That woman wasn't wrong to love deeply or completely, but she was wrong to believe that love required permission from its recipients, that being a grandmother was something that could be granted or revoked by administrative decision. I am Emma and Tommy's grandmother, not because Michael allows it, but because I became that person the day each of them was born. That relationship exists independent of access or approval, deeper than proximity or convenience, stronger than the adult complications that sometimes interfere with its expression. Last Sunday, Emma asked me to teach her how to knit. As I guided her small fingers around the yarn and watched her concentrate on creating something useful and beautiful with her own hands, I realized what this year of separation had taught me. Love doesn't disappear when someone tells it to go away. It doesn't diminish when it's rejected or unacknowledged. It simply waits, patient and enduring, ready to resurface when conditions allow truth to be spoken again. Emma's stitches were uneven, her tension too tight in some places and too loose in others. But she was learning, and learning requires patience with imperfection, faith that practice leads to improvement, trust that something beautiful can emerge from tentative beginnings. "Nana Sarah," she said, holding up her work for my inspection, "will you teach me to make something I can give to someone I love?" "Of course, sweetheart," I replied, thinking about gifts and love, and the way handmade things carry the energy of the hands that created them. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to make something for you," she said simply. "Something you can keep forever so you remember that I remember. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth."